April 1st saw the release of Sony's Morbius, based on the Marvel comic book character who made his debut as a Spider-Man villain. The movie has been brutally savaged by critics, and as we shall see, there may be a couple of reasons for that. In this review then, I will first go through what I liked, what I didn't, which I think corresponds with a lot of the issues most reviewers have, what may have caused those issues, and finally, another reason why certainly some critics may judge this movie harsher than other comparable movies. If you're worried about spoilers, this video will be very light on that, and not reveal anything that couldn't have been worked out from watching the trailers alone. For all its flaws, and make no mistake about it, there are absolutely flaws as we shall see, Morbius is an altogether entertaining movie. The direction is good, the casting is great, the score emotes the Nolan Batman movies, which kind of works here. It is far darker than most Marvel movies, but with some humor sprinkled in here and there, and there's a very nice reference to the original 1922 Nosferatu, which I immensely appreciated. I'm not in any way going to elevate this into a good movie, because it objectively is not that. But there is fun and entertainment to be had here. Case in point, I had more fun with this movie than I did with either Marvel's Shang-Chi or Marvel's Eternals. Although that may say more about those movies than this one. A prerequisite to have fun with it though, and this is related to its flaws, is that you have to grant the movie two kinds of asks. Not just two asks, we should be so lucky, but two kinds of asks. One is that on multiple occasions, the movie will ask you to switch your brain off. Don't question, don't look for reasons or motivations, just go with it, because the movie demands so. The other is that at other times, the movie will ask you to at the very least partially switch your brain back on again, as you have to fill in some narrative blanks yourself. By which I mean, the movie will at times cut straight from A to C, leaving you to figure out what the unseen B between the two must have been, and then accept that. In other words, the movie asks a lot of you, and for probably most people it will be asking too much. But if you can grant what it asks, you're gonna have a lot of fun with this movie. Still, that intermittently switching your brain on and off, all in the service of just accept it, otherwise you'll be pulled out of the movie, does mean that there are some major structural issues at play here. Fundamentally, all of the movie's issues are down to a disjointed and poorly pieced together narrative. Both between and even within individual scenes, there is connective tissue lacking. That's why you have to intermittently accept what is happening and fill in the blanks yourself. Because all the scenes and shots required for one cohesive narrative simply aren't there. I would speculate that those scenes were filmed, and that at some point they had a cut of the movie which had a cohesive narrative. But that cut of the movie could easily have been around 3 hours long. To which Sony head honcho Tom Rothman likely would have said, "You have an hour 45 minutes, make it happen." Now, I don't know for certain that that is what happened, but given the particularity of the movie's editing issues, that seems likely. Because what has been cut here is connective tissue. Throughout the movie, you can clearly see that some seconds are missing here, some seconds are missing there, and some minutes are missing there. All in the most probable name of bringing the movie's running time down to the 1 hour 45 minutes mark. Incredibly, the pacing is fine, but the narrative is disjointed, and that is a big part of the reason why professional reviewers have it in for this movie. And I can't argue that point. It's not quite a Frankensteinian abomination, we're not there, but an extended Snyder cut, if you will, of this movie would have served it well. Another recurring criticism leveled against Morbius is that it feels as though the movie was made in the early 2000s. And I can't argue that either, because it does. In terms of how comic book movies have matured and evolved in the decades since, this feels like something of a throwback, as it might as well have been made in the midway point between Ben Affleck's Daredevil and the original Underworld. Of course, this issue was shared with the previous Venomverse movies. which I incidentally think is a much better name for this Sony non-MCU Marvel adjacent Spider-Man villain universe thingy. Venomverse. Nice and simple, and Venom was the modern launch of it. But back to my main point, both Venom and Venom Let There Be Carnage also feels like movies out of time, which tells me that the issue here is the producers, Matt Tolmach and Avi Arad. And yes, I said Matt Tolmach first, and deliberately so. From the notorious Sony hack, we learn that Matt Tolmach was the one Sony deferred to during the making of their amazing Spider-Man movies back 1 decade ago. So that would, if anything, be even more potent now. I honestly don't know if Avi Arad had any real involvement here outside of on paper. Be that as it may, that all of the Venomverse movies so far in a sense feel 20 years out of date is a producer issue. What it comes down to is that the producers apply the wrong formula when making the movies. You see, there are different formulas for making different kinds of movies. There's a generic formula for romantic comedies. There's a generic formula for Oscar bait dramas. There's a generic formula for mindless action movies. And there's a generic formula for over-the-top summer blockbusters like the ones we've seen since the 90s. Back in the early 2000s, it was this generic formula for over-the-top summer blockbusters that was applied to comic book movies. Since Hollywood suddenly realized that these movies were summer blockbusters, so that's how they treated them. But then came Marvel Studios and the MCU, where Kevin Feige and his team created a new, proprietary formula for comic book movies and applied it to their Marvel movies. The rest of Hollywood saw the success that these movies had, but they couldn't crack Marvel's secret formula just from watching the movies. Many tried to replicate it. Some succeeded partially, but most failed. Because it's a proprietary Marvel formula that most other producers in Hollywood just don't grasp, because they're not into comic books or comic book movies. Among those who evidently don't grasp it are the producers behind the Venomverse, Matt Tolmach and Avi Arad. While there are some superficial things they learn from the MCU in there, and Kevin Feige even provides them with notes, they've fundamentally applied the traditional formula for a generic summer blockbuster to the Venomverse movies. So the same formula they used back in the early 2000s. And when you apply that formula to a comic book movie even today, whether they intend to or not, a movie that feels 20 years out of time comes out by default. So that's another reason why the critics have it in for this movie, which again, I can't fault. But some critics seem to go the extra mile in taking this down, which I speculate might be due to the lack of the message. Morbius is a movie which scores pretty darn high on the diversity and inclusion charts, so no one can attack it for that. It takes all the boxes, even in the movie's leads. You might interject that there are 2 white males in the lead, but one of them is implied to be... The movie is so inclusive that it even represented me by having my native language spoken on screen. But all of that representation is completely natural. Nothing is forced here, and there is no virtue signaling, no agenda, and no hyper-partisan ideopolitical messaging like there was in the Batman and some more recent Disney outings. And remember, in the last few weeks, Disney staff have even admitted on camera that there is indeed an overt ideopolitical agenda in their programming. That attitude is also shared by a number of professional reviewers, the same ones who will always highlight diversity and inclusion as a reason to let other issues slide, like they did with, for instance, Marvel's Eternals. But Morbius got no such free pass, and I think that is because there is no ideological bent here. Instead, it is simply real life reflected, which you don't even think about unless you pay particular attention to it. And arguably, that is how it should be. That is, after all, real diversity, representation, and inclusion right there. Based on the early reactions and box office results, I would not be surprised if this movie does not earn enough to warrant a sequel, but it doesn't really need one. Towards the end, the movie sets up what is next for the Venomverse. And for those that may still wonder, this movie does indeed establish that it does take place in the same universe as Venom. By way of Daily Bugle cover stories, we are informed that at the very least Black Cat and the Chameleon already exist in this universe. And by implication, there is a Spider-Man native to this universe as well. And I would put money on that Spider-Man being Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. I'm actually excited about the opportunities inherent in that. So even if there might not be a Morbius Part 2, I do hope that Matt Tolmach will continue what has been started here. But he needs to partner up with someone who can help him shift the formula and get upcoming Venomverse movies up to where comic book movies are today. Because if Tolmach fails in that, this Venomverse is going to crash and burn, just as badly as last time he and Sony tried building a cinematic universe around the Amazing Spider-Man. Building a thriving Venomverse can be done, but not the way they did it then, and not the way they're doing it right now in this moment. This can still be salvaged, but Tolmach needs to find a better production partner, and fast. Let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments.